the most enchanting moments of my life came when I had the opportunity to hike through the terraced rice paddies of Langde, a small village high up in the mountainous province of Guizhou in China. I can still almost taste the mist that enshrouded the steep green ridges all around me as I balanced precariously on the narrow, bunded walkways that marked the boundaries of each paddy. The shallow yet calm pond water, punctuated only by eager little shoots of rice breaking through the surface, reflected endless additional paddies that rose into the thick mist above me. It was an experience I'll never forget. No wonder the lady who sold me my bus ticket to Langde at the last town back had asked me, "So you know about that place, huh?" Yeah, I did. Word had gotten around. Over the past couple of decades, word has also gotten around about another collection of spectacular rice terraces long unknown to the outside world. These are the rice terraces carved out of the rugged hills of the central Cordillera on the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines. You've probably seen a picture of them at some point, an endless succession of concentric terraces getting steeper and narrower as they rise up the side of a mountain. From an aerial perspective, they almost look like stairways to heaven. Perhaps M.C. Escher would have drawn something like this had he ever traveled to Asia. In 1995, the rice terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. As aesthetic marvels of human ingenuity in a rugged environment, they are a seemingly perfect marriage of intensive agriculture and landscape engineering. According to UNESCO, these remarkable terraces were built some 2,000 years ago and have been continuously maintained ever since. But as we'll learn, there's a lot more to this claim than meets the eye, for the terraces have been subject to a lot of hyperbole and myth-making over the centuries. So in order to tell their story properly, we're going to need to start at the beginning, with the origins of rice itself. Today, rice comprises the staple food for just under half of the world's population. But rice began its rise to prominence as a humble, wild swamp plant. And most types of domesticated rice have always been grown in standing water. Originally, wild species of rice tended to flourish in what is known as monsoon Asia, a vast swath of humid and well-watered marshland found throughout the Indian subcontinent, continental Southeast Asia and southwestern China, and on to Indonesia and the Philippines. The first strains of rice to be domesticated by humans, however, seem to have been grown around 9,000 years ago in continental Southeast Asia and southwestern China. Now, once domesticated, much of the appeal of rice lay in how easily new varieties could be cultivated that were suited to new environments. Today, there are over 120,000 varieties of cultivated rice, in every color imaginable. But nearly all varieties fall under one of two basic classifications. The first is indica rice, whose grains are longer, sturdier, and do not stick together. If you've ever eaten basmati rice or dined at an Indian restaurant, then you've eaten indica rice. Then there is japonica rice, whose grains are shorter, softer, and stick together after boiling. Japonica rice is ideal for delicacies like sushi and most East Asian dishes. No matter the variety, though, a great advantage of rice is that, unlike wheat, it does not need to be pulverized into a mash or flour before processing it into food. Once the pot is boiled, rice is ready to eat. But despite its ancient origins in the region, rice was not always synonymous with Asian culture and cuisine. In fact, until the first millennium AD, much of northern China, Korea, Japan, and island Southeast Asia ate very little, if any, rice. Instead, they subsisted mostly on wheat, millet, and sorghum, with taro common in outlying subtropical regions. In Indonesia, steles at the magnificent Buddhist temple of Borobudur, dated to around 900 AD, make no mention of rice, just wheat. It was only with the spread of a particularly productive strain known as champa rice from northern Vietnam that wet rice agriculture in Asia really took off. And that's because even in difficult growing conditions, The Champa strain could produce 2 to 3 crops of rice in a single year. And a well-tended rice paddy, under optimal conditions, could yield as much as 3 to 4 times as much as its dry field cousins growing wheat or millet. It is little wonder, then, that nearly all of the world's most densely populated civilizations arose in lands where rice was grown. This includes India, the Tonkin Delta, Java, and southern China. Lands that grow wheat simply cannot feed that many mouths. But Champa rice could support these new booming civilizations. The only problem? Wet rice will only produce its famously high yields of grain if constant, meticulous inputs of labor are invested in its cultivation. And when you cast your eyes over the Philippine rice terraces, you get a sense of why. Because to create those wet growing conditions, farmers have to dig and constantly maintain rice paddies that can hold water in, while building dikes and irrigation channels to direct the water flow. Rice is a thirsty crop, so the terraces need consistent rainfall to keep the paddies watered. But storms and heavy rains can erode the terraces or cause mudslides, so you have to go out and redo your work. Rice isn't the only organism that loves those wet conditions, so you have to watch the fields for pests and weeds. Then there's all that planting and harvesting. Champa rice grows so quickly that you can get a new crop every 120 days. And even when you've gathered up all the rice plants, you still have to dry them out and then thresh them to separate the grains from the stalks. Now consider that an individual rice plant or stalk might yield around 100 grains of rice. And for your average bowl of rice, you're looking at several thousand grains. All that adds up to a lot of work, and even just your ordinary flat rice paddies, to say nothing of scaling up and down the mountainsides you have to do in a rice terrace. This labor-intensive nature of wet rice agriculture has led to a famous debate over the so-called Great Divergence that emerged between Europe and Asia on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. In 1957, the Marxist scholar Karl Wittfogel published a book with the title of Oriental Despotism. Its thesis was simple. Because only a large, centralized state could marshal the manpower and resources necessary to undertake the massive irrigation works required to support wet rice agriculture, this facilitated the rise of authoritarian elites who used their reliable agricultural surplus to fund lavish pet projects such as the Taj Mahal and Forbidden City. Other scholars then took Wittfogel's conclusions further, arguing that the acute need for human labor in wet rice agriculture provided a clear disincentive for Asian elites to develop labor-saving mechanical devices. But in Europe, where labor was scarce and farming was often an unrewarding slog, there was a huge incentive to invest in clever machines that did our grunt work for us. These theories have floated around in academic circles for a long time, but in fact, the rice terraces of the Philippines provide a wonderful case study of a densely populated society that depended heavily upon wet rice agriculture without ever feeling the need to draw upon the resources of a large centralized state. The terraces have always been primarily communal endeavors, with generations orally transmitting the knowledge of how to tend, improve, and expand them, and different communities cooperating and sharing in their use. There was no great emperor or pharaoh who ordered their construction. In fact, we might say that these rice terraces flourished precisely because their cultivators had turned their backs on an expanding state. Because the emergence of these incredible terraces seems to have been born out of necessity, as the indigenous peoples of the Philippines tried to resist Spanish domination. Now, the Philippines is a nation of islands, over 7,000 of them by most counts. Just under 3,000 of these islands are considered substantial enough to have been named. Together, they are about the size of Italy, with the larger islands of Luzon and Mindanao accounting for 2/3 of the total surface area of the country. When Ferdinand Magellan arrived in 1521 and claimed the archipelago in the name of Spain, There was no single cultural or political identity to which all the islands subscribed. In fact, the very concept of the Philippines is a Spanish invention. The phrase was coined in the year 1543 in honor of the future King Philip II. It was an odd name, to say the least, appended to an archipelago with a long-standing melange of Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic cultures, whose members spoke hundreds of distinct languages and dialects. In fact, the influence of Islam was so prevalent in the south that the island of Mindanao was well on its way toward becoming an Islamic sultanate had the Spanish never arrived. Ultimately, however, it would be Spanish influence that won out, and for the next 3 centuries after Magellan's arrival, they gradually consolidated their control over the entire archipelago, spreading the Christian gospel as well as a distinct Spanish nomenclature onto both the landscape and the populace. But some parts of the Philippines were easier to conquer than others. After the main settlement on Luzon, Manila, fell to the Spanish, only the lowland coastal villages quickly submitted to their rule. Those who lived higher up in the mountainous Cordillera range of central Luzon fiercely resisted Spanish incursions, ambushing any Christians who came in search of gold. The Cordillera range itself is enormous, stretching some 200 miles from north to south and 73 miles across, and their indigenous inhabitants, the Igorot peoples, include many tribes and languages. It is at this point at which scholars now believe the rice terrace culture of the Cordilleras began to flourish. New evidence suggests that with the highlands secure from direct Spanish rule, a large number of inhabitants from the coastal lowlands abandoned their homes and fled into the central hills. There were many reasons to do so: avoiding conversion to Christianity, evading Spanish taxes, or to put some distance between themselves and the devastating diseases the Spanish brought with them. Now, why does this sudden migration upland matter? Because the native hill dwellers of the Cordillera range did not grow rice before then. They mostly grew taro. Of course, this still required the use of pond fields, but it was done on a much smaller scale, and largely in wide, irrigated valleys, not steep mountainsides. The reason is simple. The population in these mountains wasn't nearly as dense as it would later become, and modest taro fields provided enough for its needs. As late as 1789, the Dominican priest Francisco Antolin ventured into the Cordillera and described a barren landscape whose inhabitants scraped by on a meager livelihood. It seems that it was only with the sudden influx of a large number of refugees that the mountain tribes felt the need to cultivate a more productive crop. Well, fortunately for them, the new migrants brought the agricultural skills and know-how long practiced on the coastal lowlands, wet rice agriculture. The result was a mad rush to construct as many newly irrigated fields as possible to feed the growing population, a task that wet rice agriculture was particularly well suited to do. Before long, the gentler slopes of the river valleys were filled to the brim with large rice paddies. A source of water was close at hand, the grade wasn't steep, and retaining walls often didn't even need to be faced in stone. Although there are many rice terrace landscapes to be found across the Cordilleras, those inscribed on the World Heritage List are specifically found towards the southern end of the range in Ifugao province, where the people became particularly adept terrace builders. Because as the more accessible and easily worked terrain got crowded, the Ifugao looked higher and higher up the mountain ridges to build new rice paddies, creating some of the steepest terraces in the mountains. But it wasn't just the crush of new migrants that spurred the expansion into higher altitudes. In Ifugao, gender-neutral primogeniture governed the inheritance of property. This meant that the eldest son or daughter would inherit the majority, if not all, of the family's rice fields. So for the rest of the siblings, the surest way to accumulating their own wealth and power was to strike out on their own and build new rice fields in less desirable locations. And this meant scaling ever higher up the slopes of the mountain. Now, terraces are found throughout the world, and their functions are not confined to wet rice agriculture. At Machu Picchu, for instance, The picturesque terraces of a royal Inca estate were designed primarily for erosion control. The cultivation of maize was only a secondary use, and the total annual yield wasn't nearly enough to feed all of the people who lived on the estate. In Ifugao, terraces served both functions equally well. Pummeled by more than 120 inches of rainfall per year, the people of Ifugao couldn't hope to grow rice on the steep terrain all around them without a robust system of erosion control. But by its very nature as well, wet rice shoots tend to grow best when fed by a steady stream of fresh water. So this was the challenge, to channel a non-stop stream of fresh water into an artificially graded plot of flat land, all the while ensuring that the whole edifice isn't washed away by too much water. So just how were the gravity-defying rice terraces of Ifugao built? The goal, simply put, is to retain soil on a level plain with a manageable water source. So it should come as no surprise to learn that no one in Ifugao would even think of building a new terrace without first securing a reliable source of water. Canals dug straight out of the earth could extend for as many as 3 miles from a mountain spring or a stream. Securing this supply line was more important than ease of access. A farmer would be happy to hike much further every day to a well-watered field than take a shorter trip to a poorly irrigated one. And it wasn't just the distance. Clear water, delivered directly into a rice paddy, would pay dividends for generations to come. As a 6th century Chinese treatise on agriculture once pointed out, whether the land be good or poor, if the water is clear, then the rice will be good. There's a reason for this. Good water will deposit minerals from further upstream into the rice pond and constantly stir up the soil layers below. This creates a natural process of self-fertilization without any additional human inputs. Rice paddies blessed with such an arrangement will remain fertile for decades, if not centuries. A far cry from European dry field agriculture, which requires constant applications of expensive fertilizer to keep the soils even marginally productive. Now, once a water source is secured, the next step is to clear the slope of any and all brush and undergrowth. A ritual specialist is then called in to perform a divination ceremony involving chicken bile. If the omens are good, construction on a new payo, or rice field, can begin. This involves back-breaking labor, digging and disposing of soil and rocks, leveling of the plot, building inlets and outlets for the flow of water. The many different layers of gravel, soil, and water can all be seen in this cross-sectional diagram of a typical terrace field. And then there's the wall itself. Not all rice terraces in Ifugao have stone retaining walls. Of some 32,000 individual rice terraces in the region, about 1/3 of them have been reinforced with such a wall, mostly on the steeper slopes where the grade commonly reaches up to 25 degrees. Hundreds of large stones must be quarried or hauled up from the riverbed and then lugged great distances to the rice field. Finally, they are stacked vertically at an average angle of 73 degrees. The average wall is about 6.5 feet tall, but some can rise as high as 20 feet. Regardless of their height, all walls require constant maintenance. One of the most important tasks is also the simplest: pulling weeds. Left unchecked, their roots will creep into every little nook and cranny, loosen the stones, and eventually allow water to seep through. The ideal wall cover is a soft bed of moss, which protects the stones from direct sunlight without inserting roots into the foundation. Now, how long did it take to build a single terrace field with a retaining wall? It was once thought that the high degree of craftsmanship and sophisticated engineering on display must have required years of hard work for a single terrace. In more recent times, however, various eyewitness observations suggest that the process could be accomplished far quicker than scholars once believed. In the 1960s, one researcher watched 5 Ifugao men build several stone-walled terraces in just 2 months. So it really comes down to just how many friends and family members can you recruit as helpers. All in all, a small team of perhaps 4 to 5 men working full-time in the agricultural off-season, could probably build a single terrace with a stone retaining wall in less than a month. As a result, the dizzying array of rice terraces that we see in Ifugao today could easily have been built within just a few centuries. Children in Ifugao were taught the fine art of terrace construction from an early age. When the American anthropologist Harold Conklin conducted field research in Ifugao in the 1960s and 70s, he took pictures of young boys building makeshift terraces and irrigation canals in the mud for fun, while their parents worked in a real terrace nearby. As children, they would have learned how to keep their balance on the narrow walkway or the bund that rimmed the edges of each terrace without falling into the pond or dropping their heavy loads. Before long, they would be able to navigate through the maze of rice fields with ease, climbing from terrace to terrace by means of diagonal stone staircases built into the side of their walls. Of course, as children, they also would have seen firsthand the sort of intensive labor that awaited them in adulthood. After all, building the terrace was merely step one. Step two was planting the rice crop. The process began long before heading out to the field itself. At some point in the late fall, usually in November or December, rice seedlings would begin their life in an indoor nursery to minimize the amount of time they would have to spend in the volatile summer weather outdoors. After 10 to 12 weeks in the nursery, the rice shoots are transplanted to the paddies, spaced out evenly in straight lines. During the outdoor growing season, which usually lasts from April through June, the shoots require constant care and water levels must be managed with precision. The crop is finally harvested in June and July, right at the onset of heavy rains. This is unfortunate timing, for rice must be dried out thoroughly in the sun before it can be stored. A common sight during this time is for the entire community to band together within an instant at the sound of thunder and to move all the sunbathing rice under cover. A successful harvest typically culminates with religious celebrations, the sacrificing of pigs and chickens, and liberal consumption of rice beer and wine. All in all, it is estimated that by this point, each family will have invested around 250 days of farm labor into each acre of rice fields that it owns. But at least they are richly rewarded for their hardship. Each of those well-tended acres will produce a little over 1 ton, or about 2,000 pounds of rice. Again, that's at least 1/3 more grain than a dry field wheat crop will produce, and often much more, and all without the use of any fertilizer. Despite its unlikely fertility, Ifugao showed very few signs of political centralization or social stratification, the sort of things that Wittfogel and many other scholars once saw as an inevitable development within a dense society supported by a complex irrigation and blessed with a massive agricultural surplus. So far, archaeologists have only managed to uncover a handful of exotic grave goods underneath the homes of prominent families who lived in the center of the villages. Though the gap in wealth between these families and the rest of the villagers appears to have been small, they probably did have some special responsibilities that gave them prestige. One of these responsibilities was to oversee property disputes, something guaranteed to occur in the tightly packed labyrinth of overlapping rice terraces. Anthropologists have observed one particularly intriguing method of conflict resolution in modern times: a wrestling contest between two champions selected by each party to the dispute, with a village mediator to ensure that the two sides were evenly matched. In addition to ensuring village harmony, these slightly more resourceful families probably also ate a little bit more rice than their neighbors. One surprising study found that despite the great quantities of rice grown in Ifugao's terrace fields, it still wasn't enough to feed the ever-burgeoning population of the region. As a result, most people actually got more than half of their daily protein needs from dry field sweet potato or taro grown on even more marginal slopes that could not be turned into rice paddies. So just when we think the capacity for agricultural innovation has been reached, the enterprising farmers of Ifugao keep raising the bar. And as for political centralization, they apparently had little need of it. For example, 1 or 2 times a year, all the rice fields needed to be drained at the exact same time to undertake pest control. Pests are a major nuisance on the paddies, and all manners of beetles and insects will feast on the rice plants and crawl to the next paddy over if left unchecked. Even worse are earthworms and swamp eels, who burrow into the terraces and bore holes through the dikes. A little of this is okay, since it helps maintain the water flow across the terraces, but too much, and the water will drain out and the walls start to collapse. But the logistically complex task of draining the terraces to root out pests is apparently achieved without any central coordinating authority, a phenomenon anthropologists describe simply as self-organization. Today, the rice terraces of Ifugao occupy an ambiguous place in Philippine society. On the one hand, they are promoted by both the government and tourist industry as symbols of an enduring link with the ancestral past stretching back some 2,000 years. This claim is based almost entirely on the uninformed speculations of foreign visitors in the early 20th century, who found it impossible to believe that so many intricate terraces could have been built any faster. But archaeological evidence and carbon dating of rice field soil layers now prove beyond a doubt that rice was not grown in Ifugao prior to the 17th century. And the Spanish, despite making tentative forays into the highlands of Luzon as early as 1572, did not record a single description of the rice terraces until 1801. Yet despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, no one seems to be in a hurry to revise the official version of Ifugao's past. This includes UNESCO itself, which continues to tout the 2-millennia-old narrative about the terraces. The reason is simple. The Philippine Rice Terraces are now a major domestic and international attraction, with more income now derived from tourism than the rice crop itself. The people of Ifugao are presented as the authentic ancestors of all Filipinos, untamed by the Spanish and unconverted to Christianity. This is both a pejorative and a contradictory image. The Ifugao are admired for successfully resisting Spanish colonialism, while denigrated for their staunchly pagan ways. There's a great deal of irony in all of this, not least of which is the fact that Ifugao wet rice agriculture almost certainly represents the mixing of two distinct groups in just the last few centuries: rice-growing coastal lowlanders with taro-growing upland natives. And of course, Philippine rice terrace culture isn't confined to Ifugao province. Although some of the best examples are found there, there are incredible terrace landscapes constructed by other groups in neighboring provinces, a legacy of centuries of cultural osmosis and interaction between the many peoples of the Cordillera ranges. But myths continue to be created, one of which can be found on the back of the 20 Philippine peso banknote. There you'll find an engraving of the Banawe Rice Terraces, described as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, Banawe is a truly stunning rice terrace landscape, rising nearly 5,000 feet above sea level. Its valley produces some of the region's most iconic photographs, and it is easily the most visited of the terrace landscapes. There's only one problem. Banawe was not included in the UNESCO listing because it was deemed to have too many modern structures, which have undermined its integrity as a site. And yet, ironically, it's those modern structures which have helped create the infrastructure to bring tourists and money to the area, which is helping maintain these terraces into the future as agriculture modernizes and young people understandably shy away from a career lugging rice up and down the mountains. As is always the case, the truth is far more interesting than the myth, and more inspiring too. The Ifugao rice terraces remind us that nothing is static in our ever-changing world, and that we humans are always coming up with new and creative ways to meet the challenges of our day and age. They tell the story of endless human ingenuity in the face of a demographic and political crisis. The sudden arrival of hostile and deadly Spaniards, along with a potentially destabilizing influx of refugees into a poor and precarious landscape. And that's a common thread that runs through all of the World Heritage sites we've toured together. our species can nearly always adapt to new and unexpected challenges, whether they be military threats, like the Great Walls of China, or feats of engineering, like India's mountain railways, whether they respond to political and religious imperatives, like the temples of Bagan, or to environmental and survival pressures, like Mesa Verde. And as sites like the Rice Terraces show, even those challenges that pose an existential crisis to an entire culture can be met. The results are wondrous feats of accomplishment that are the milestones of human civilization, each one a stepping stone from our distant past to our collective future. After all, if the resilient men and women of the Cordilleras could do this in just a few centuries, and with only crude tools and their wits at their disposal, imagine what we as a species will continue to do with the resources at our disposal over the coming centuries.